You don't even know how much I love you. So small, so innocent. But will love be enough? The trees whisper. The night watches. I shouldn't be here. Every step feels heavier. But I have no choice. I have to go before I change my mind. Please, forgive me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Make sure to subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into the story. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the village. Birds sang in the trees, their melodies drifting on the soft breeze that whispered through the dense green forest. In the distance, the rhythmic sound of a drum echoed from the heart of the village, signaling the coming of evening prayers. The scent of fresh earth and wildflowers filled the air, but inside the small hut at the edge of the village, there was a different kind of tension, a quiet anticipation. Madeline lay on a straw mat, her body slick with sweat and exhaustion. Her breaths were shallow and rapid as she clutched the edge of the mat. The pain was intense, a sharp, unrelenting wave that seemed to consume her very being. Her face was pale, and her once bright eyes now looked dark with exhaustion. Her hand clutched the rough fabric of her faded wrapper, the same fabric that had once brought her comfort in times of simpler days. Mama Janet, the village midwife, hovered nearby, her weathered hands steady as she guided Madeline through each painful moment. The old woman's face was a calm mask, though her sharp eyes never missed a detail. She had delivered countless babies in her lifetime, but today something felt different. The air around them felt charged, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting. "Breathe, Madeline. Breathe deeply. It is almost time," Mama Janet said in a soothing voice, her accent rich with the wisdom of age. Her hand rested on Madeline's trembling shoulder, grounding her. Madeline nodded weakly, trying to focus on her breath, but the pain was unbearable. The cries of a newborn were already beginning to echo in the room, signaling the arrival of new life. Her heart pounded in her chest, not only from the physical pain, but from a fear she couldn't explain. It had been a long, lonely journey to this moment, pregnant without a husband, rejected by the village and facing an uncertain future. But now, her baby was coming, and she had hoped against hope that this moment would bring a new beginning. Suddenly, the room grew still as the cries of the newborn filled the air. It was a cry of life, raw and full of promise. Mama Janet smiled warmly, her weathered hands gently wiping the tiny baby clean before wrapping her in a worn, colorful cloth. "It's a girl," Mama Janet said, her voice filled with warmth as she placed the baby in Madeleine's arms. Madeleine's heart raced as she gazed down at her child, her eyes brimming with both love and fear. The baby's tiny hands curled and uncurled, and her soft, dark skin glowed in the fading sunlight. But as Madeleine lifted the child closer, something unsettling settled in her heart. The joy that should have filled her was absent, replaced by a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She peered closely at the child's face, hoping for that first moment of connection, but the baby didn't look back. Mama Janet's eyes softened as she watched Madeleine's growing unease. She stepped closer, her voice low and gentle. "Madeleine, she does not see?" Mama Janet whispered, her gaze tender yet filled with concern. Madeleine's heart dropped into her stomach. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she cradled the baby tighter. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, barely holding back the tears. "My daughter. She can't see?" Mama Janet nodded, her expression solemn. She is blind, Madeline. She cannot see the world." For a long moment, Madeline said nothing. Her heart felt as if it had shattered piece by piece. She stared down at her daughter, her beautiful, helpless child, and all at once the weight of the world seemed to crash down on her. The world would never accept her now. A blind child. How could she possibly survive in this unforgiving village? How could she raise a child who would be seen as cursed? The judgment was already beginning. The whispers she could already hear in the wind. A cursed child, a bad omen. The words would spread like wildfire, and no one would offer a helping hand. The father of the baby had died months ago, and now she was truly alone. A tear slipped down Madeline's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She had no time for tears, no time to grieve. She had to be strong for her daughter. But as the baby whimpered softly in her arms, Madeleine couldn't shake the crushing despair that threatened to swallow her whole. Outside, the women of the village waited eagerly, whispering about the birth. They had heard of her pregnancy, but they didn't know the truth of the child she had given life to. What will they say? Madeline thought bitterly. How will they look at me? She kissed the top of her daughter's head, her lips trembling as she whispered a prayer. "I'm sorry, my love," she murmured. "I'm sorry." The sound of footsteps approached the door, and before she could process it, Mama Janet was beside her again, her hands gentle but firm. "You must rest now, Madeleine. Your journey is not over yet," she said. Madeline nodded absently, still lost in the turmoil of her thoughts. But as she looked down at her daughter once more, something deep inside her stirred. There was a glimmer of hope, a small, flickering light that refused to be extinguished. This was her daughter, and no matter the challenges that lay ahead, she would protect her. She would find a way. That night, as the moon climbed high in the sky, a storm began to brew within Madeleine. The baby's soft cries filled the hut, a constant reminder of her responsibility. But as the night wore on, a dreadful silence settled over her heart. She knew what she had to do, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. She couldn't stay here, not in this village where no one would show mercy, not with a child who would be seen as cursed. She stood, cradling the baby in her arms, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the darkness of the forest loomed ahead. It was there, in the deep shadows, where she would leave her daughter. With a final, anguished look at the tiny face in her arms, Madeline stepped into the night. The forest swallowed her whole, its ancient trees towering overhead, their branches twisting like the fingers of ghosts reaching out to claim her. The cries of the baby were muffled by the thick darkness, and Madeleine's heart pounded in her chest, her feet moving as if they had a mind of their own. As she walked deeper into the forest, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She paused near an old tree, looking around, hoping, no, praying, that someone would stop her. But the forest was empty. It was just her and her daughter, alone in the vast, empty night. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this." The wind whistled through the trees, but there was no answer, only the endless crying of her daughter, a sound that would haunt her forever. With a final, heart-wrenching glance, Madeline set the baby on a patch of soft grass beneath the tree. "Someone will find you," she whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. "Someone will take care of you." And then, without another word, she turned and fled into the darkness, leaving behind the one soul who needed her most. The sun had barely begun to rise when Madeline arrived at the edge of the forest. Her legs were sore from the long, silent walk, and her heart was heavy, dragging her down with each step. She could still hear the baby's soft cries echoing in her mind, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She wiped the tears from her cheeks, trying to steady her breath, but there was no escaping the weight of what she had just done. She had left her daughter, her own flesh and blood, alone in the wilderness, a decision that made her stomach churn with shame. The trees around her seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like ghostly fingers, warning her to turn back. But she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not with the world already turning its back on her. She had made a choice, one that would change the course of both her life and her daughter's forever. The village was only a short distance away, but Madeleine had no intention of going back. The whispers, the mocking eyes of the people who would call her a cursed mother had already started. She couldn't bear it. The shame, the judgment, would eat her alive if she stayed. Behind her, the forest loomed like a dark, suffocating presence, and before her, the village waited, ignorant of the tragedy that had just unfolded. As Madeleine walked, her thoughts drifted to the baby she had left behind. What would happen to her? Would someone find her? Would the child cry herself to sleep, waiting for a mother who had abandoned her? Or would the forest take her, just as it had taken so much else in her life? Madeleine pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the dusty path beneath her feet. She would walk. She would keep walking until the fear and shame no longer had the power to stop her. She had to move forward, even if it meant running from the consequences of her own actions. The village was small, but filled with life. Women gathered by the river, washing clothes and chatting in hushed tones. Men sat under the shade of trees, discussing crops and weather. The children ran through the dirt roads, their laughter a sharp contrast to the storm raging in Madeleine's heart. She stepped into the clearing, her eyes scanning the familiar faces, but no one looked her way. No one noticed the way her shoulders slumped or the way her hands trembled at her sides. The weight of her decision still hung heavy around her, but she pushed it aside, forcing herself to blend into the crowd. Mama Janet had warned her. She had told her that the child was a blessing, not a curse. But Madeleine had been too afraid. The fear of rejection, of the harsh realities that awaited her and her daughter in a world that didn't tolerate weakness, had blinded her. And now, she had to live with the consequences of her cowardice. As the hours dragged on, Madeleine found herself sitting alone in the small hut she called home. The sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and the faint scent of herbs that she had collected in her youth. But everything felt wrong. The walls that had once offered her safety now seemed to close in, suffocating her with the guilt and regret she carried. She had no family left, no one to turn to. The man who had once promised to care for her and the child they had created was gone, taken from her by illness. And now, she had abandoned her baby, her own daughter. The door to the hut creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was Mama Janet, her old, weathered face filled with concern. She took one look at Madeleine's haggard appearance and shook her head in disappointment. "You left her," Mama Janet said, her voice thick with reproach. "You left your own flesh and blood in the forest." Madeleine's breath caught in her throat. The words cut deeper than any blade. I couldn't bear it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's blind. She'll never have a chance." I was alone, Mama Janet. There was no hope for her. Mama Janet knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Madeline's shoulder. You think you're the only one who's been alone? You think you're the only one who's faced fear? I've seen children abandoned before. I've seen them grow strong despite the odds. She was not cursed, Madeline. You are the one who is blind. Blind to the power of love, of family, of the strength that can come from even the most difficult of situations. Tears welled up in Madeline's eyes as she shook her head. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid. Mama Janet sighed, her hand squeezing Madeline's tightly. Fear is a cruel thing. It makes you do things you'll regret. But it's not too late. You still have a chance. Go back. Find your child. You owe it to her. You owe it to yourself. Madeline felt a surge of emotion. Guilt, regret, but also a flicker of hope. Could she really go back? Could she undo what she had done? She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, but something deep inside her stirred. Mama Janet was right. Fear had made her weak. But love, that love she felt for her daughter, even now, could make her strong again. With a trembling breath, Madeline turned toward the door. I'll go back, she whispered. I'll find her. Mama Janet nodded, her face filled with pride. You will, and you'll make things right. Madeline stepped into the sunlight once more, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of purpose. She would find her daughter, she would make amends. She would do whatever it took to bring her home, to give her the chance at life that she had been denied. And no matter what the world thought of her, no matter how much it judged her, she would keep going, because her daughter deserved it. And Madeline would not let fear control her anymore. The forest stretched out before Madeline, dark and foreboding, as though it held the secrets of the earth itself. The trees loomed like ancient guardians, their twisted branches swaying in the breeze, casting long shadows over the uneven path. With every step she took, the sounds of the village faded away, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the whispers of unseen creatures echoed in the distance. Madeline's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She had made the decision. She had promised to find her daughter, to bring her home, no matter the cost. But as she walked deeper into the forest, the weight of the night she had left behind seemed to follow her, clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She paused for a moment, leaning against a large tree, her chest heaving with exertion. The night was cooler now, the temperature dropping as the sun began its descent below the horizon. Her mind kept flashing back to the moment when she had left her daughter in the clearing, alone, vulnerable, abandoned. Every heartbeat felt like a drumbeat of guilt, reminding her of the choice she had made. Tears blurred her vision, but she quickly wiped them away, gritting her teeth against the pain. She couldn't afford to falter now. If she had any hope of finding her daughter, she needed to focus. She needed to keep moving. The forest grew denser as she ventured further, the underbrush thickening around her, making it harder to navigate. Her clothes, once neat and clean, were now torn and covered in dirt. Her feet ached from the long walk and her stomach growled with hunger, but Madeline didn't care. Nothing mattered more than finding her child. For hours, she walked through the dense woods, the darkness creeping closer with every passing moment. The air grew heavier, colder, and the sound of her own footsteps seemed to echo in the silence. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind wouldn't allow it. Not until she found her daughter. She tried to block out the terrifying thoughts that plagued her. What if no one found the baby? What if the wild animals claimed her? What if she had left her daughter to die? The fear gnawed at her, threatening to drown her in its intensity. But every time the doubt crept in, she pushed it away. She had to believe. She had to believe that her daughter was still out there, waiting for her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she stumbled upon the old tree where she had left the baby. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around, her eyes desperately searching the area for any sign of her daughter. But the clearing was empty. The soft patch of grass where she had laid the baby was now undisturbed, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment, Madeleine stood frozen, her heart sinking into her chest. She was too late. Her daughter was gone. The world had taken her, just as it had taken everything else. She collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as they pressed against the ground. The tears came then, hot and fast, as the crushing weight of her failure consumed her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." She had failed her child. She had left her to die, and now there was nothing left but the painful truth of her actions. But as she sat there, lost in her despair, a sound reached her ears. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The soft whimper of a baby. Her heart leapt in her chest as she stood, her eyes scanning the clearing once more. The whimper grew louder, and Madeleine followed the sound, her steps quickening, her pulse racing with hope. The sound led her deeper into the forest, and after a few moments, she found her. There, nestled beneath a large tree, was her daughter, still wrapped in the same cloth she had been abandoned in. Her tiny body was curled up, her face turned toward the ground, her tiny hands reaching out in search of something. The baby was crying softly, her small, helpless sounds cutting through the silence of the forest like a beacon. Madeleine's heart soared as she rushed to her daughter's side. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she gently scooped the baby into her arms. The warmth of the child's body was a balm to her aching heart, and she pressed the baby close, her tears falling freely onto the soft fabric. "My baby," Madeleine whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I've found you. I'm so sorry." The baby stopped crying for a moment, her tiny hands reaching up to touch Madeleine's face. Though her eyes couldn't see, she seemed to sense the comfort in her mother's embrace. Madeleine held her tightly, her heart full of both relief and guilt. She had found her daughter, but the journey was far from over. She stood, her legs unsteady as she cradled the baby close. The night was growing colder, and the darkness of the forest seemed to press in around her. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Madeleine felt a glimmer of hope. She had come back for her daughter. She had found her, and now they would go home. With the baby securely in her arms, Madeleine turned back toward the village. Her steps were slower now, the weight of the child in her arms both a comfort and a burden. She knew the path would be difficult, that there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that nothing could stand in her way now. She would protect her daughter no matter what. As the moon rose higher in the sky, the forest grew quiet once more. The cricket's songs filled the air, and the occasional howl of a distant animal echoed through the trees. But for Madeleine, the world had narrowed to just one thing: the tiny life she held in her arms. She walked through the forest, each step bringing her closer to home, closer to a future she hadn't dared to dream of. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: she would never abandon her daughter again, no matter what. The village was quiet when Madeleine finally returned, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the journey. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the humble homes that dotted the village. The sound of crickets chirping filled the air, and the wind rustled through the trees. But it was a stillness that felt unsettling, a reminder of the decision that had brought her back. Madeline's heart pounded in her chest as she walked down the familiar path toward her hut, her daughter cradled against her chest. The warmth of the tiny body in her arms was a comfort, but the burden of the truth still weighed heavily on her. She had returned, but what would the village say? What would Mama Janet think when she saw that Madeline had returned with a child she had once abandoned? The whispers she had feared before were already beginning. Women gathered in the market square, their eyes darting toward her, their whispers loud enough for her to hear. The cursed one returns, a mother who abandoned her own child, her own fruit. The words stung, but Madeleine kept walking, her eyes straight ahead, her mind focused on one thing: her daughter. As she reached her hut, she paused at the door, her breath catching in her throat. The world outside felt like a distant memory, like another life she had long since left behind. But now, as she stood on the threshold, everything was different. Her daughter was in her arms, a living, breathing reminder of the choice she had made, a choice she would live with every day for the rest of her life. With a trembling hand, Madeleine pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of her home greeted her, the earthy smell of dried herbs, the faint scent of wood smoke, the worn fabric of the mat on the floor. But it felt foreign now, as if everything in this place had changed in her absence. She looked around, her eyes lingering on the empty corners of the room. There was no one here, no one to witness the return of the lost child. Madeleine moved toward the mat and gently lowered her daughter onto it. She sat down beside her, gazing at the tiny face that was so like her own, full of innocence and potential. She ran a finger over the baby's small hand, her heart swelling with emotion. This was her daughter. This was the child she had abandoned, and now she was here. She was home. For a moment, Madeleine simply sat in the silence, her heart racing as she let the reality of the situation wash over her. She had done something unforgivable, something that would forever define her. But she had returned. She had found her daughter, and no matter what the world thought of her, she would make things right. She couldn't undo the past. She couldn't erase the pain she had caused. But she could give her daughter a future full of love and hope, a future that no longer involved fear, abandonment, or shame. Madeleine looked down at the child, her heart breaking all over again. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll never leave you again." The baby stirred, her tiny hand reaching out as if sensing the depth of her mother's words. Madeleine leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of the baby's head, her tears falling freely. She had failed her daughter once, but she would never fail her again. The door to the hut creaked open, and Mama Janet stepped inside, her eyes softening when she saw Madeleine with the child. "You found her," Mama Janet said, her voice full of quiet wonder. Madeleine nodded, her eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "I couldn't leave her. I couldn't let her die." Mama Janet stepped forward, kneeling beside Madeleine. She looked at the baby, her wise eyes taking in every detail. "You've done the right thing," she said quietly. "Now you must raise her, love her, and show the village that she is not cursed. She is a blessing." Madeleine's heart ached as she looked at the old woman. Mama Janet had always been a voice of reason, a guide for the lost. She had warned Madeline before about the dangers of fear and the power of love. And now, as Madeline looked at her daughter, she realized just how right Mama Janet had been. "I will raise her, Mama Janet," Madeline said, her voice full of determination. "I will love her with all my heart. I will show this village that she is not a curse. She is my daughter." Mama Janet smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "You've learned, Madeline. You've learned that love is the strongest thing we have. It can overcome fear, it can heal wounds, and it can change the world. And you, my dear, are going to change this village with your love." Madeline smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with hope. She had come so far. She had faced the darkness of her own fear, the shame of her past, and now she was ready to move forward. She would not let the whispers of the village or the judgment of others define her or her daughter. She would build a new life, a life full of love. As the night stretched on, Madeline sat beside her daughter, her hand resting gently on the tiny chest that rose and fell with each breath. She whispered a prayer of thanks, a prayer for the future, a prayer for the little girl who would one day know the truth about the past, about the love that had been there all along. And as she sat there in the quiet of her home, Madeline knew that her journey was only beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but with her daughter by her side, she would face it with strength and love. Dear viewers, what lessons did you take away from Madeline's journey? Her story is a powerful reminder of the consequences of fear, but also of the transformative power of love and redemption. We all make mistakes, but it's never too late to make things right. What would you do if you were in Madeline's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chapter and feel inspired by the emotional journey, please give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest updates. Thank you for watching, and stay blessed.